Consider parabola by the equation -2 x squared minus 10x plus 3. So to find the vertex, you have to use this equation, x equals -b over 2a. The coordinates of the vertex, they often refer to them as h, k. This is the x coordinate of the vertex, and this is the y coordinate of the vertex. The x coordinate, is found using this formula. So I believe sometimes they say h is equal to -b over 2a. I use x, I guess I should really say the x coordinate of the vertex. So I'm looking at my function, and this is in a format ax squared plus bx plus c. So my a is -2, my b is -10, and my c is 3. So I plug in b and a into this formula. So it's a negative, and I substitute everything in parentheses, and the b is -10, and 2 times the -2. So a -10 will be +10 over 2 times -2 will be -4. I can simplify this, or I can just put it in my calculator. 10 divided by -4 is -2.5. Okay, that's the first part. Okay, then the next part. So we now have this x coordinate of the vertex, also known as the h. It's -2.5. Now, how are we going to go about getting the y coordinate of the vertex? Well, you guessed it. We will plug in the x value into the function. Some textbooks write, how do you find this y coordinate? You just do the function evaluated at h. You plug in the h, the x coordinate you just found for the vertex, and then you plug it in. So let's see it. F of -2.5 is -2, -2 point. And I always use parentheses when I substitute things in, especially this negative number. It's really important. All I did was rewrite the equation, replacing all the x's with -2.5. You may be able to enter this into your calculator in one fell swoop. I'm going to try to do so right now. So here's a calculator, and I'm going to use the negative sign here because I am putting a -2 in. And I multiply that by, in parentheses, -2.5 squared. The squared button is right above the log button, or right here. Okay, then minus 10 times -2.5. I could have put that in parentheses too. Probably would have looked a little bit better. In fact, maybe I do want to. I'm not sure if the calculator is going to interpret those parentheses as multiplication or not. So I did put the multiplication as well. And let's see how our calculator does this. I am a little bit worried because I'm worried that maybe it's going to do -2 times -2.5 and then square that answer. We'll see how this works. This is not typically how I would do it. No, it did it fine. Okay, so we put all this into the calculator and we got an answer of 15.5. So 15.5 is the y coordinate of the vertex. So this is our answer right here for part A is parenthesis -2.5 comma 15.5 in parenthesis because that is the ordered pair that make the vertex. Okay, vertical asymptote. Next. A vertical asymptote is where the graph is hitting the y-axis. I'm sorry, vertical intercept or y-intercept they're asking for here. It's where the graph hits the y-axis, so we have to plug in x equals 0. Actually, they also call it an f-intercept because the function is f, but it's formerly known as y-intercept. But all I have to do is plug in 0 for x, zero squared, ten times 0 is 0. 0 squared is actually just 0. -2 times 0 is 0, minus 0. 0, 0 minus 0 is 0, plus 3 is 3. So your vertical intercept is 3. Now the x-intercepts. So typically you would plug in 0 for y to find a x-intercept. And we do that, we get this equation 0 equals negative. See the equation up there. So I'm plugging 0 in for the f of x or the y. So I get left with -2x squared minus 10x plus 3. So I can't solve an equation like that just by moving the variable around or doing algebraic steps. We need to use the quadratic formula. So it's a -b plus or minus the square root, or x equals. To solve this for x, use the quadratic formula. So it's x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4a times c all over 2a. We said this earlier, but our a is the coefficient on the x squared term, so it's -2. B is a coefficient on the x to first, so it's -10. And C is 3. So a -10, I'm substituting in parentheses. You always want to substitute in you're putting your thing in parentheses. All over 2 times -2. So it's 10 plus or minus the square root. 10 squared is 100, or -10 squared. You have to make sure to put the negative in parentheses like that when you're calculating this. And then I know I'm gonna have a negative times a negative, so that'll be a positive. So it'll be 4 times 2 times 3, positive 24. All over 2 times -2 would be -4. So this simplifies to be 10 plus or minus the square root of 124 over -4. I calculate what the square root of 124 is, and I got 11.13. I'll just say 11.14, just to be simple. So this is all equal to 10 plus or minus 11.14 all over -4. Now I truncated my answer quite a bit here. You would not want to do that. You probably want to keep at least twice as many decimals as they want you to be accurate in the final answer. For my work though, just 2 decimal places is probably fine. And it'll be fine. Okay. So from here, it separates into 2 different equations that come from this. One coming from, if I ignore the negative here and just focus on the positive, then I would get 10 plus 11.14 all over -4. I have to add the numerator first. That's a common mistake. Somebody might, and when you try to put something like this into your calculator, you have to make sure to put this numerator in parentheses. Otherwise, it's going to do 10 plus 11.14 divided by -4, and you'd only divide that by the 11 by -4. So you would want to make sure, putting this into the calculator, you do the parentheses. But I just did that by itself. 10 plus 11.14 is 21.14 divided by, and then the last thing is, actually, when you have a fraction like this, you always want to do everything in the numerator until you get one number in the numerator, and all the operations in the denominator until you get one number, and then divide would be the last step. So now I divide by -4, and I get an answer of -5.285. If I just did 2 decimal places. Fine, and then the other answer is, okay, so now if I ignore the positive sign and I just focus on the negative sign, then I would get 10 minus 1.14 all over -4. The numerator would simplify to be -1.14 divided by -4. And I get positive 0.285. So those are my 2 solutions, my x-intercepts, -5.285 and 0.285. There we go.